They arrived in autumn, always autumn. The winding coach trail toward Everwell Seminary was flanked by pines, impossibly tall and silent, whose needles whispered secrets each time the wind passed through. At the end of that trail stood the seminary itself, a towering mass of stone, perched on a forested ridge, its slate rooftops like jagged knives against the gray sky. To those who looked too quickly, Everwell resembled any other aged institution. Its gates bore the Latin inscription Scientia supra omnia, knowledge above all. But for those who stayed long enough to listen, it was clear the stone walls remembered screams, that the ground beneath bore witness to things no tongue dared name. The year was 1903, and by then, Everwell had earned its reputation. Each year, a fresh selection of boys, gifted, promising, eager to transcend the mortal world through logic and language, arrived with satchels in hand and letters of recommendation sealed in wax. Each year, some returned at winter break, pale and silent. By spring, most had changed. By the third year, none ever came back. Still, no parent questioned the arrangement, because the letters they received in return were articulate, intelligent, measured. Their sons, it seemed, were learning well. The story begins with one such student. Nathaniel Gray was 16 the year he arrived at Everwell, bookish and quiet, the child of a widowed schoolteacher in Haverford. His mother, Elizabeth, had held onto her son with the desperate strength of a woman who'd lost everything else. But the scholarship to Everwell was too generous, the opportunity too rare. She made him promise to write every week. He did, for the first 2 months. His letters were full of wonder, descriptions of the school's immense library, the carved serpents in the stairwell, the antique observatory at the northern peak. He wrote of professors who debated theology until midnight, of students who could quote Cicero from memory. His words glowed with reverence. But by December, the letters changed. In his 7th letter, Nathaniel spoke of dreams. I hear footsteps, Mother, in the halls at night, not those of boys or masters. Heavier, slower, like someone dragging something behind them, something large and wet. I try not to listen, but I always wake just as the sound reaches my door. Elizabeth assumed. He was homesick, but then came the 9th letter. I've found a room, Mother, that isn't marked on the map, behind the south chapel, past the collapsed wing. It was sealed off until I saw Professor Ellery enter it with a black candle in hand. I followed. Inside, the walls are lined with bones, small ones, human, I think, but arranged like constellations. He never finished that letter. The ink trailed off mid-sentence. By January, no more letters came. Elizabeth wrote to the headmaster. No reply. She wired the county magistrate. No record of concern. Other mothers in town shared the same dread, but all were met with the same silence, because Everwell was too old, too revered, too well-funded to question, and grief, for most, was easier to bear than scandal. But Elizabeth was not most. She sold her wedding ring, paid for a private carriage, and traveled up the pine trail herself. When she reached the seminary gates, no one greeted her. The grounds were eerily empty. Winter frost clung to every vine, every stone statue. The chapel bells were frozen silent. Only the ravens circled above. She pounded on the great oak doors until her hands bled, and finally, a boy no older than her, Nathaniel, opened them. But his eyes were wrong, clouded, emotionless, his uniform perfect, but his lips pale as chalk. Can I help you, madam? He asked, monotone. I'm here for my son, Nathaniel Gray. He hasn't written. The boy blinked once. There is no one here by that name. She pushed past him. Inside, the seminary smelled of stone and rot. The walls were damp. Tapestries hung heavy with mildew. No laughter, no voices, no footsteps, only the constant, low hum of something distant and unseen. She called out her son's name again and again. Nathaniel. No answer. Instead, an elderly man in red robes emerged from the shadowed corridor. I am Headmaster Vale, he said calmly. You must be mistaken. We have no record of a Nathaniel Gray. Elizabeth pulled a letter from her coat, then explained this. It was written in her son's careful hand, signed and dated from the seminary's own address. Vale did not look at it. I suggest you return home, madam. You are unwell, But she did not return home. That night, she hid in the music chamber, waited until silence fell. Then she crept into the forbidden wing, the one her son had described in his unfinished letter. The door was warped, marked with ash. Inside was no classroom, no dormitory. It was a crypt. Rows of desks sat arranged before an altar made of teeth. The blackboard bore strange glyphs, angular, alien, that seemed to shimmer when she looked too long. And at the front of the room stood a figure in robes. He did not speak, did not move, but he was not alone. From the floorboards, from beneath the desks, emerged the students, one by one, crawling, twisting, bodies bent in impossible ways, their mouths sewn shut, eyes stitched open. And among them, Nathaniel. His lips trembled, his hands reached out, but he did not speak. Behind him, the robed figure raised a long, curved blade. Elizabeth screamed. The room vanished. She awoke in the chapel, lying on cold stone. It was morning. A priest stood over her. Kind eyes, warm hands. "You are safe," he whispered. "You wandered too far. The old wings aren't meant for visitors." She stared at him. "My son. He was here. I saw him. There are no boys by that name here," the priest said softly. "And you have no son." He pressed something into her hand, a train ticket, dated today. Elizabeth never spoke of that night again. But for the rest of her life, she wore a necklace. It held a single object, a brass button from a boy's school coat, engraved with the letters E.S. It was all that had followed her home. Years later, the seminary burned. The papers said it was lightning, a natural disaster. No bodies were ever found. But in the smoke and ash, villagers swore they saw something. Shapes in the flames, hands pressed to blackened windows, mouths open in screams, but no sound, only silence, and on the wind, the scent of scorched parchment. They say knowledge demands sacrifice. But at Everwell Seminary, who decided what was worth knowing? What would you trade, not for power, or wealth, or fame, but simply to understand? And would you still call it knowledge, if it costs you everything? In 1877, the cliffs of Daggers Hollow were already soaked with salt, blood, and memory, or fishermen refused to cast their lines. Near its outcrop, locals marked their calendars by the storms that gathered there, and children, when they misbehaved, were warned of the school that watched from its edge, Everwell Seminary for Girls. The name was spoken softly, if at all, not out of reverence, but reluctance. It had stood for over a century, untouched by war or time, its windows always dark, its spires chiseled sharp. It was the kind of place you didn't look at too long, the kind of place that watched back. And now, Elspeth Carroll had been invited. The letter came in early spring. Her father, a broken man clinging to faded aristocracy, had called it a miracle, a chance to restore their family name. Elspeth had read it twice, once with hope, and once with dread. It was handwritten in black ink, each line precise, almost surgical. "We are pleased to inform you of your acceptance into Everwell Seminary. For girls, attendance is compulsory. The curriculum is fixed, 3 years, no less. You will observe silence during meals, maintain curfew without fail, and speak nothing of the bell tower." There was no signature, just a red wax seal, cracked at the corner, depicting a blindfolded angel with a scale in one hand and a flame in the other. She arrived in early September, under rain. The coach passed through to iron gates and into mist so thick it felt like breath. Everwell loomed above, a fortress of limestone and lead, its arches weathered by sea wind, its highest spire veiled in fog. Girls stepped from the carriage one by one, eyes wide. Some clutched prayer books, others whispered to themselves. Elspeth kept her hands in her coat pockets, pressing her fingers against the last gift her mother gave her, a scrap of cloth embroidered with the word remember. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she would. Madame Thorne met them at the entrance. She stood tall in black velvet, her silver hair pulled so tightly back it seemed to stretch her face. Her voice was low, dry, unwavering. "Welcome to Everwell," she intoned, as if reciting a spell. "Here we do not laugh, we do not weep, we do not question." Behind her, the faculty stood in silence. 5 women, identical robes, identical smiles, eyes that blinked out of time. "You will be shaped, purified, prepared. The world you knew has ended. And with that, the doors closed. Elspeth was assigned a dormitory on the 3rd floor. Stone walls, iron bed, a single candle in a tall brass holder. Her window faced the sea, but it was barred. She was not alone. 3 other girls shared the room. Leona, with curls like copper wire and a hunger to be seen. Miriam, who rarely spoke and carved patterns into the soles of her shoes. And Faye, whose every movement was gentle, deliberate, as if afraid to break the world around her. That first night, they listened as the bell rang. Once. The sound was hollow, ancient, like a throat clearing beneath the earth. Who rings it? Elspeth asked aloud. Faye blinked. No one, she said softly. It rings itself. Days became weeks. The schedule was punishing. Mornings began before dawn with concordance practice, which involved standing in silence around iron basins and reciting phrases in languages no one recognized. Latin, yes, but also something else, something older, syllables that didn't sit right in the mouth. After breakfast came lectures on ethics, submission, and transfiguration. Afternoons were for scripture copying, followed by silence hours, periods where speaking was not just forbidden, but punished. Elspeth once saw a girl mutter in her sleep and awaken with her tongue stained black. They learned about obedience, about penance, about how knowledge was the greatest form of suffering, and that to seek it without sacrifice was blasphemy. And every evening, at the same hour, the bell, one toll, always one, low and final. By the 3rd week, Elspeth noticed things, the way the headmistress stared too long at the crucifix, like waiting for it to blink. How the ink in their writing quills dried instantly if used for anything not in the curriculum. How the portraits on the hallway walls sometimes wept oil down their frames. But it was the girls who changed most of all. Leona, once so loud, began scratching at her scalp until her hair came out in clumps. Miriam hummed the same melody over and over in her sleep, a song Elspeth swore she'd heard somewhere before, though no one else recognized it. And Faye, quiet Faye, started drawing circles on her bedposts, over and over, always 3, always bleeding into one another. Then, on the 28th night, a girl disappeared. Her name was Cressida. She slept indoors, down, a pale thing with calloused fingers and eyes that flinched at candles. One morning, her bed was empty, her clothes gone, her name erased from the class register in perfect ink. When Elspeth asked, Madame Thorne replied only, "Faith is not a place for inquiry. It is a place for trust." The other girls accepted it. They had to. Questions meant consequences. But Elspeth did not accept it. She began to stay awake at night, listening. Sometimes she heard footsteps outside their door, bare, dragging. Sometimes she heard the bell toll twice, though no one else seemed to hear. And once, just once, she saw something move behind the glass of the bell tower. She found the diary by accident in the library, behind a false panel in the restricted wing. She'd hidden herself there after supper, slipping behind a tapestry while the other girls were herded back to their rooms. She waited until the lights dimmed, then crept into the forbidden alcove. The diary was thin, bound in cracked leather. The first page bore a name, smudged with water, Agatha. The entries were uneven, frantic, written over months, perhaps years. Do not look at the bell. It sees you back. Second year changes everything. That's when the rituals begin to take root. They say it's a school. It's not. It's a mouth. The final entry was dated exactly 11 years before. We thought we were studying. We were feeding it. Do not stay past the second year. Do not stay. The page was torn. When Elspeth returned to her dorm, she told no one. But that night, she dreamed of Agatha. In the dream, Agatha had no face, only skin stretched tight over bone, stitched where her eyes should be. She whispered from a mouth full of feathers, "You are already too late." Elspeth woke screaming. By the end of the month, another girl vanished. This time, Elspeth was ready. She snuck into the chapel that night, candle in hand, and waited. At precisely 3 a.m. The bell tolled. Not once, but 5 times. And on the 5th toll, a door opened behind the altar. From it came Madame Thorne, but she was not alone. She was dragging something behind her. Cloth, rope, bone, a figure in white, unmoving. Elspeth could not see the girl's face, only her hand, trailing the floor, fingers bent backward at unnatural angles. The headmistress whispered words in that dead tongue, then raised her hand toward the heavens. The candle flickered out, and the chapel was silent again. The next morning, no one remembered the girl's name, except Elspeth and Faye, who pulled her aside in the corridor. "Do not ask about the bell," she whispered. Her voice trembled. Her eyes, usually soft, were hard, wet with fear. Elspeth stared at her. "You've seen it too." Faye nodded once, then leaned close. "You're the only one who still hears the tolls." That night, the storm came. Rain clawed at the seminary walls. Wind screamed through the keyholes. Lightning danced along the edge of the sea, throwing the bell tower into sharp silhouette. Elspeth stood at the window. Something was wrong with the light. The tower was lit from within, a pale, steady glow. The bell swayed, though there was no wind near its height. And there, behind the bars, stood a figure, motionless, watching. Its hands were not hands, but branches. Its eyes not eyes, but absence. It wore no robe, no cloak, only shadow, and still. It watched. Elspeth stared back. She did not sleep. She did not blink. When morning came, the tower was empty again, but she remembered the toll, the glow, the figure, and she understood. The seminary did not teach obedience. It taught silence. And the bell was not a warning. It was a call, a summons. A hunger. By the second term, something had changed, not in the weather, which remained bitter and soaked with salt, nor in the walls, which still bled moisture and creaked like breathing things, but in the atmosphere, the slow, subterranean shift in the air that precedes rot. Everwell had always demanded obedience, but now it demanded reverence. Gone were the arithmetic drills and history recitations. The chalkboards stood blank. The books locked themselves overnight. The girls were told that numbers were for merchants, letters for peasants. But silence was for the chosen. Madame Thorne spoke less often now, and when she did, her voice held something brittle beneath it, like glass submerged in cold water, moments from shattering. "You are no longer students," she told them on the first morning of term. "You are vessels. Hallow yourselves accordingly." No one asked what that meant. They already knew not to ask. Concordance began on the second Tuesday of February. The term had been whispered since the first day of term, always with weight, the way one might speak of a funeral before it happens, or the final confession before a hanging. And now it had arrived. That evening, the girls were woken by a bell that did not ring. They simply knew. Each of them rose, dressed in the dark, and walked barefoot, without question, toward the southern stairwell. The catacombs awaited. The descent was long, narrow, the stairs carved crudely into the earth, walls lined with unmarked stone. No torches, no guides, only Madame Thorne at the front, and her staff flanking the rear. Their eyes were painted black, their mouths covered with silk. Elspeth counted 22 girls. By the end of term, there would be fewer. The chamber was circular, domed with brick. Its walls pulsed faintly, like lungs beneath damp cloth. At the center stood a basin roughly carved, obsidian in color. It seemed to absorb the candle light around it. Inside was water that did not move, did not reflect. But the moment they entered, it rippled. Before a word was spoken, they were instructed to kneel in a ring. Madame Thorne lit the black candles one by one, her hands trembling slightly. Then came the chant. It had no language, no melody, just sound mouths opening and closing. Like wounds, each syllable felt like a bruise pressed into the brain. Elspeth's tongue moved before her mind understood. The words came from someplace deeper. Faye began to cry. Madame Thorne raised her hand, but did not stop. The candles flickered. The water shimmered. And just before the final chant was spoken, Elspeth felt her breath leave her body, not forced out, not stolen, but surrendered. As if it belonged to someone else now. After concordance, the girls were different. They walked slower, spoke softer, smiled never. Leona stopped brushing her hair. She said it no longer felt like hers. Miriam bit her nails until they bled, then collected the clippings and buried them behind the dormitory in silence. And Faye could not sleep. She said she heard voices at night, whispers, faint but unmistakable, not in dreams, but as she lay awake, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. "They say my name," she told Elspeth one morning, "but not just the name I use, the name only my mother knew, the one she whispered when she thought I was dying." Elspeth didn't know how to answer, so she took her hand. They sat in silence until morning bell. In the third week, Leona had a dream. She spoke of it in a whisper, as if naming it aloud would call it back. "I was walking through a hall made of bone. The doors were locked, but there was a voice behind each one. They kept asking the same thing. 'Are you ready?' 'What did you say?' Elspeth asked. Leona's eyes darkened. 'I said I didn't know what I was being asked.' Miriam began to rebel. Where the others shrank into themselves, Miriam sharpened. She scrawled questions on bathroom mirrors in chalk, slipped notes under professors' doors. "Where are the missing girls? Why do we kneel to nothing? Why is the bell always watching?" The answer came swiftly. She was caught. That evening, she was dragged from her bed by his staff in silence. Her screams echoed down the hall like something feral. She was taken to the Red Wing. No student ever returned from the Red Wing the same. Some didn't return at all. That night, Elspeth turned again to the diary. The ink had faded in places, but the fear remained intact. The entries were more frantic now, smudged, scratched, annotated over themselves. "Do not speak during concordance. The water hears. They punish the body to preserve the vessel. The second year is not a test, it is a tether." And finally I ran. I reached the road. I thought I was free. They found me. I returned walking. I do not remember how, only that my hands bled and my mouth would not open. Elspeth's fingers trembled as she traced the name at the bottom of the page, Annabel Wren. Class of 1872, she remembered now. The portrait in the northern corridor, the one with the torn frame, the one whose face had been scraped off with a blade. When the next storm came, the sea turned black. The rain fell sideways, hammering the seminary like it meant to peel the stone away. Thunder rolled so deeply that it rattled the chandeliers, and in the chaos, Faye vanished. It happened between curfew and dawn. Her bed was empty, her blanket folded, her boots still wet from the evening walk. Leona panicked. Miriam, freshly returned from Red Wing and pale as death, refused to speak. Elspeth moved quickly. She remembered Faye's whispers, the voices, the bell. She led the search. They checked the kitchens, the observatory, even the tower stairs. But the chapel was where the silence led them. The doors were ajar. The candles still burned. Faye lay in the center of the aisle, naked. Salt lined her body in deliberate spirals, each one leading inward, toward her chest. Her hair was soaked, her eyes wide open, but she did not scream. She only whispered. I didn't open it. She did not remember coming there, or undressing, or drawing the symbols. But when she looked up toward the bell tower above, she wept, not with fear, with recognition. That night, Elspeth could not sleep. She watched the candle on her desk melt, watched the shadows crawl. Then, when the others had drifted into dreamless stupor, she knelt beneath her bed with a stolen compass nail and scratched a single word into the wooden floorboards. Exit. Not escape. Not run. Double quotes exit. As if the seminary were a theater, and this madness a performance. As if there could be a door out. She stared at the word until sleep pulled her under. And in her dream, she saw the basin again. But this time, it was not empty. It was full of mouths, all speaking her name. She woke in a sweat. The candle was cold. The room quiet. And beneath the bed, only clean wood. The word was gone. By the time Elspeth entered her second year at Everwell, she understood that silence was not simply a rule, it was a weapon. It cloaked the sins of the seminary. It smothered questions before they could take root. And worst of all, it preserved the third years in their uncanny stillness, like dolls that once moved, once laughed, but had since been emptied and rewound every day. The third years walked along the corridors like animals trained for some unseen parade. They wore their hair in identical braids, their uniforms pristinely pressed, their lips closed in what no longer looked like discipline, but vacancy. Elspeth watched them closely, and the closer she looked, the more she saw. Faint lines beneath their skin like old surgical incisions, but circular. Sigils carved in scar tissue. Their placement was precise, behind the ears, along the collarbone. sometimes just beneath the wrist where a pulse should throb. And not one of them smiled. Not even once. Clara Meeks stood apart, even among them each. Morning, at exactly 6 minutes past dawn, she walked to the cliff's edge alone. She faced the sea, hands folded in front of her like a penitent bride, and whispered a string of words too soft to catch in full. Elspeth once tried to listen, crept close beneath the garden arch, but the words weren't English, nor Latin, nor anything she'd heard even in the concordance sessions. They were round sounds, looped syllables, language like water swallowed too quickly, and Clara's mouth never closed between them. When she turned to walk back, her eyes were red not from tears, but from strain, as if she'd seen something in the ocean and dared to name it. No one ever stopped her. The days grew colder. Leona, once fiery and untamed, now scribbled riddles in the margins of her textbooks. She claimed the teachers no longer spoken lectures, only mouthed instructions. Words without breath, she called them, like reading without eyes. Elspeth tried to stay focused. She kept her questions small, focused on survival. But even that became difficult when she noticed Faye had stopped speaking entirely, not out of fear, but as if her voice had been misplaced. She sat during meals, staring at her bowl, lips slightly parted, and she hummed. The melody was simple, childlike, 3 notes rising, 1 falling, repeated endlessly, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, always the same. It burrowed into the room like smoke. Leona once asked her to stop and immediately clutched her nose, blood pouring between her fingers. After that, no one interrupted the humming. Desperate for answers, Elspeth turned again to Annabel Wren's diary. The pages were now warped with damp, the ink smearing into veins of madness. The entries no longer tracked time, they tracked unraveling. There is a door under the bell tower, not a door of wood, but of will. We passed through it during concordance, but only in spirit. They mark the body to teach it silence. But some of us do not return whole. We are emptied, hollowed, and filled again. The crypt of names is where the truth hides. The salt rooms peel memory from soul. The body forgets its own weight. 3rd years are vessels. We are not meant to stay 3 years. We are meant to survive 3 rituals. Not all return. Some return hungry. Elspeth read these lines by candlelight, her hands trembling, across the room. Faye hummed without pause. Leona slept in fitful twists, murmuring riddles in her dreams. And Miriam had had enough. I'm going in, she whispered one night. Elspeth looked up. Where? Miriam's eyes were wild, alive, fractured. The 3rd year dormitory. I need to know what they are. They're students, Elspeth said. Or, they were, exactly. Miriam smiled faintly. I want to see what's left. They waited until the halls emptied for prayer, while the others knelt beneath the altar, murmuring rehearsed contritions. Miriam slipped away. She carried only a candle and a hairpin stolen from Madame Thorne's drawer. Elspeth watched her vanish up the north stairwell. She did not sleep. She sat at the dormitory window all night, candle melting beside her, watching the mist swirl around. The bell tower like a serpent returning to its nest. The bell did not toll. The wind did not shift. But the moment she closed her eyes, she felt it. A soundless cry. A presence folding into the seminary like breath exhaled beneath a heavy door. When dawn arrived, the 3rd years assembled for morning procession. Clara Meeks led them toward the cliff, to buy 2. And there, walking in perfect step beside her, was Miriam. But her face was wrong, not unfamiliar, too familiar. The same slope of the nose, the same dark brows, even the scar on her chin where she'd once fallen during firewood duty. But her eyes, they were empty, not glassy, not tired. Hollow. Elspeth stood frozen as they passed. Miriam didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't see her. Leona screamed. She backed into the corridor wall, clutching at her hair. No, she whispered. No, 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 no. Faye didn't speak. She simply turned toward the bell tower window, placed a hand against the glass, and hummed. But now, the melody had changed, more complex. The notes bent backward on themselves, impossible intervals. It sounded like something trying to remember its own voice and failing. Elspeth collapsed that night. Her body gave in, but her mind did not. She dreamed of the crypt of names, It was a room without shape, lit by bone candles. The walls weren't stone, they were flesh, stretched taut over something massive and coiled. And in the center was a book, bound in what Elspeth instinctively knew was hair. She approached it. Trembling. Inside were names. Dozens. Hundreds. Each one crossed out, except the last, Miriam Halberd. And below it, in wet ink, Elspeth Caro. She woke gasping, throat dry as ash. And the humming had stopped. Not faded. Stopped. Faye was gone. Her bed undisturbed. A trail of salt led to the door, then vanished. The others did not notice. The school did not ask. Only Elspeth stood beneath the chapel arch that evening, staring up at the bell tower. Waiting. And when the light flickered behind the barred window, she understood what the diary had meant. Third years were not survivors. They were selections, shells, and whatever lived inside them now was not human. Miriam was still there. She attended lectures, folded linens, and stood in line for the evening procession. Her handwriting was identical, her posture perfect. She looked like Miriam, sounded like her. Too, on the rare occasion she spoke. But Elspeth knew Miriam was gone. What remained was a semblance, a pattern-wearing skin, and no one else seemed to notice. Leona noticed other things. At first, it was little slips, misplacing her boots, forgetting her own prayer schedule. She laughed it off, called it fatigue. But then it worsened. She awoke one morning and asked Elspeth where she was. When Elspeth answered, Leona stared blankly. "I've never heard of that place," she said. "This is Everwell," Elspeth whispered. "The seminary." Leona blinked. Then smiled too wide. "I think I was in a garden just now. Or was that yesterday?" She turned back to the window and hummed quietly to herself. Elspeth did not remind her that Faye used to hum, too. She was afraid it might bring something back, or worse, let something. In her the walls changed necks. What had once been familiar corridors became endless. Doors relocated. Windows vanished. The north hallway, once leading to the library, now led in a slow spiral, ending where it began. The girls were told it was poor memory, fatigue, menstrual strain, but Elspeth kept track. She scratched symbols into the walls just faint enough to avoid detection. Each night, she'd follow the path again. But her symbols were no longer where she left them. They had moved, or the walls had. Time, too, unraveled. Bells rang at inconsistent intervals. Meals arrived late. Once, the sun failed to rise for 3 days, and no one mentioned it. Only Leona whispered, "Is this what dying feels like? Being erased while still moving?" Elspeth couldn't answer, because she wasn't sure if they were still alive, or simply unremembered. It was desperation that led her to the chapel. The storm had returned, an icy tempest that bent trees like prayer rods. Snow blew sideways across the cliffs. The seminary groaned under its weight, but the faculty remained serene. Elspeth slipped into the chapel at midnight. She wasn't sure what she expected, but what she found was a door, a small one, behind the altar, hidden by drapery. It wasn't locked, only heavy, as though it had been asleep for decades and resented waking. She pulled it open and descended. The tunnels were not stone, but bone-white plaster, smooth and curved. They wound downward like a snail shell, tight and airless. Leona followed silently. Neither of them spoke. Words felt unwelcome here. They reached the bottom after what felt like hours. The passage opened into a vaulted corridor, high-ceilinged and silent. And there, carved into the walls, names, hundreds, maybe thousands, all etched by hand, some slanted with age, others sharp and recent, each name followed by 2 words, status, departed. Some names repeated, the same girl, different years. Genevieve Ellsworth, 1833. Genevieve Ellsworth, 1836. Genevieve Ellsworth, 1839. Elspeth walked further and further. The air grew colder. She found a section labeled 1877 to 1880. Her hand reached forward, instinct guiding her, where logic failed. And there it was, Elspeth Caro, class of 1880, status, departed. The breath left her body. Leona gasped. "No," Elspeth said aloud. "I'm still here." But the walls did not care. The stone didn't blink. Only Leona's voice, small and weak. "Have we already done this before?" They ran, back up the tunnel. Back through the chapel, into the corridor, now drenched in candlelight. But something had shifted. The doors to their dormitory were locked, their names scratched off the registry. The hallway portraits watched with sharpened eyes. One bled from its frame. Faculty passed them with unnatural slowness, their gazes too long, too cold. One of the instructors, Miss Harrow, or someone wearing her, stared at Elsbeth's chest and whispered, "You still carry a name." But not for long. They slept in the laundry room that night, cold water in the buckets, silence wrapping them like burial cloth. And when Elspeth woke, Faye was gone again. This time, there was no trail. No salt, no humming, not even an empty bed, only a faint stain on the pillow, like dried seawater, and a single black feather in the corner of the room. Leona broke. She sat in the window for hours, murmuring nonsense. She asked where they were, what term it was, why her hands were to light. Then she screamed, "Where's my name?" and clawed at her own arms. Elspeth held her until the trembling passed, but in her heart, she feared Leona's name had already been carved, buried deep in the crypt. That night, in the hollow hour between two tolls, Elspeth returned to the diary. The pages stuck together now, wet, as if the book had been underwater. One entry remained, the final one, written in jagged, slanted letters. "I saw what lies behind the rituals. We are not learning, we are unlocking. We are keys, not students, not girls. Keys. The sigils are locks, the chants are combinations. They are not hollowing us out, they are tuning us. Third year is not the end. It is the beginning of something much older." And then, below, in a final line, "When the bell tolls twice, the door will open. Pray you are not standing on the threshold." Elspeth dropped the diary, and from above, in the far distance, the bell tolled once. Then again. Twice. It began, as most unmaking does, with a dream. Every night now, Elspeth found herself beneath the bell tower, not standing at its base, not approaching its door, but already inside, already climbing, barefoot, breathless, toward the thing waiting above. The steps were wet with something thicker than water. The walls dripped wax, and her heartbeat slowed the higher she went, as though her body knew what waited and wished to delay its rival. At the top, a door of salt, and beyond it a throne, built of bone and scorched pews, tangled with hair, lined with salt rings. Upon it sat a figure, still, watching, wearing her face. Only the eyes were wrong, not hollow, not dead. Just indifferent. The same way a flame looks at paper before consuming it. She woke each time, with blood on her lip. Her mouth full of salt, the sheets soaked with sweat that smelled faintly of brine. Each morning, she walked the halls of the seminary, and saw new cracks forming in the architecture, both stone and human. The girls no longer whispered during chores. They didn't need to. They had begun humming in unison. That same tritone pattern Faye once hummed in her fugue. Now it came from multiple throats at once, soft, unblinking. Even the faculty began moving as a single body. They glided through the corridors with an elegance that was unnatural, as though joints had been repurposed, as though bones had remembered something ancient. Elspeth watched her own reflection begin to betray her. At first, it was brief. Her mirrored image would blink a second too late, or tilt its head while she remained still. She dismissed it. Until the bruises appeared, pale purple patches beneath her ribs, across her throat, around her ankles. No pain, no memory, just markings that grew darker each morning. One night, as she brushed her hair, the mirror fractured without a sound. 7 lines, each perfect, none reaching the edge. And in that broken mirror, she saw 2 versions of herself, one reaching, one hiding. She went to Madame Thorne, not for answers, for mercy. Thorne stood at her usual place beneath the chapel's stained glass, hands folded, eyes closed, as if waiting to be asked. Elsbeth's voice was tired when it came. "What is happening to us?" The headmistress opened her eyes slowly. They were gray, almost colorless now. "If you fear what you will become," she said, "you were never meant to ascend." Elspeth stared. "You've known all along." Thorne's lips curled slightly. "We do not plant seeds here, child. We ripen them." At dinner the next night, Leona collapsed. She had not spoken for 2 days, had simply walked where she was, led. But as she lifted her spoon, her body convulsed. She choked, not on food, but on something that rose from within her, a gurgling sound. Then her mouth opened and a stream of water poured out, laced with salt and something black, something stringy. She convulsed again, and again, then slumped forward, face in her bowl, the water still dripping from her lips. No one moved. No one screamed. The girls kept eating, unblinking, hands moving in rhythm. The clink of spoons on porcelain echoed like a dirge. Elspeth stood. She reached for Leona, but when she touched her skin it was dry, cold. Leona blinked once. Her eyes flickered as if rebooting. Then she turned her head and whispered something Elspeth would remember for the rest of her life. "We've been here before. We'll be here again." That night, the seminary breathed, not metaphorically. The walls pulsed outward, then contracted. Once, twice, as though the entire structure had grown lungs, or something inside had begun to stir. Elspeth returned to the bell tower. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for sleep. She walked barefoot through the halls, past the dormitories, past the chapel, until she reached the base of the tower. The door was no longer locked. It was ajar. She stepped inside. There were no stairs. Only mirrors, lining the walls, suspended from above, even beneath her feet. A spiral of mirrors leading not up, but down, a descent masked as ascension. Each step echoed without sound. Each reflection showed a different her. Elspeth laughing, Elspeth screaming, Elspeth covered in script she could not read. Elspeth with no eyes, Elspeth with someone else's smile. At the spiral's center, a hum began, familiar. It wasn't in her ears. It was in her chest, a thrum, soft and deep, like a second heartbeat slowly syncing with the first. And the mirrors began to weep, not water, but salt. She reached the final chamber, a hollow of white stone, polished to a shine. At the center, a bowl sat on a pedestal, identical to the one used in Concordance. But this bowl reflected her face, even in the dark. She stepped closer. The hum grew louder, and when she peered inside she saw herself, seated, on the throne. Not in a dream. Now, the throne was here, beneath the seminary, or within it. Or was it a construct made from years of silence, obedience, fear? Elspeth stood in the crypt and saw not a ritual space, but an altar built from every girl who had tried to resist. Each vessel was a rung on a ladder they were never meant to climb. Each prayer a chisel hollowing them out. Each concordance a slow surrender. The seminary had never been a place of learning. It was a cathedral of transformation. And they were not students, they were doors, and she was already half open. The semester began again, but it did not feel like a beginning. It felt like a reaping. The dormitories were quieter now. Beds once filled with breath and laughter lay cold. Third years had vanished over the break. No goodbyes, no acknowledgments, just empty shoes, folded blankets, and silence. In their place, first years, bright-eyed, nervous, obedient. Lambs with ribbons in their hair. Their names were unfamiliar, their faces interchangeable. They followed rules instinctively, bowed too quickly, smiled with the faint desperation of those who believed they still had choices. Elspeth watched them from a distance. She remembered being one of them, but more than that she remembered everything. Leona's bed was gone, not just emptied, erased. The plaque on her wardrobe now bore someone else's name. No one mentioned her. No one asked. Faye was simply forgotten. The name no longer summoned recognition, even from the faculty. Elspeth tried once, in class. She raised her hand and asked, "What became of Faye, of Leona?" Madame Thorne did not look up from her notes. "There are no such names here," she replied. And Miriam only stared. Unblinking. Her mouth slightly open, as though waiting for sound. But none came. Elspeth was now a third year. She should have felt honored, elevated. Instead, her hands shook when she folded her uniform. Her spine ached in the mornings. Her heartbeat sounded further away. The rituals intensified each day. She was led to the salt chamber, a low-ceilinged room lined with ash and bone chalk. She was told to kneel in circles of salt for hours, to fast until her vision blurred. She was made to memorize symbols that stung her eyes. Some bled, others vanished after reading, burned into her memory in ways that felt more like infection than knowledge. The air smelled of iron. The symbols spoke in dreams. Except now, Elspeth no longer dreamed. Her sleep became black, not restful, not quiet, just absent. Madame Thorne began speaking of the ascension, that it was not a ceremony, that it was a becoming. "You'll be released," she said, voice distant, from flesh and noise, from past and person. "The self is the shell, you are the key." No one asked what door they were opening. By then, they knew. One night, sleepless and thin with fasting, Elspeth wandered the seminary in silence. She moved by candlelight, her feet memorizing the warped patterns of the stone floor. Something called her. Not a sound, a pressure. Like gravity. She followed it to the library. Past the sealed wing, through a gap behind the archivist's desk. There, hidden behind a false wall, was a room she had never seen. It smelled of cedar and rot. The candlelight revealed hundreds of portraits, all girls. All in identical uniforms. Each one painted posthumously. Pale skin, folded hands, eyes closed or darkened. They lined the walls in rows, some cracked with age, others freshly lacquered. Names were etched in brass beneath each one. And there, at the center of the far wall, Annabel Wren. Her frame was thicker, heavier, the only one draped in velvet, but her painted eyes had been violently scratched out. Not by time. By hand. Elspeth stepped closer, heart thudding. She touched the frame, and from the shadows behind her, a voice spoke. "I never left." She turned, but the room was empty. The candle in her hand flickered violently, and the portraits, they had changed. All of them now stared forward, eyes wide, mouths closed, as though awakened from some long-held silence. The door behind her slammed shut. Elspeth ran her fingers over Annabel's nameplate. Something scratched beneath it, faint, almost missed. Another name, carved over time, Elspeth Caro. By the second month of the new term, Elspeth had lost entire days. She would wake in the chapel, barefoot, her gown soaked in something sweet and brown. She would find salt in her hair, needles in her sheets. Blood beneath her fingernails, that was not her own. She stopped asking questions. She started counting bruises instead. The rituals no longer masqueraded as education. They had become rites of erosion. Students were woken at midnight, marched in silence to the crypt, and told to kneel. On glass. They were cut not violently, but ceremonially, each wound precise, deliberate, a map being drawn across their skin. They bled into silver bowls and whispered things they were not taught, but somehow knew. At the end of each rite, the offering was placed inside a sealed urn. When Elspeth asked what they were offering, Madame Thorne smiled and said, "Memory." And that's when it began to vanish. First, she forgot the names of her favorite books. Then, the color of her mother's voice. Then, her own reflection. She'd pass a mirror and feel startled, like a stranger had entered the room. But the worst was the calendar. It no longer meant anything. One morning she woke and asked a girl what day it was. The girl replied, "Ascension -4." Elspeth didn't ask what that meant. Her bones already knew. Miriam now led the rituals. The girl who once questioned, who once rebelled, she wore white now. A veil, not for modesty, but to hide the fact that her lips no longer moved when she spoke. Her voice echoed, not through the chapel, but inside the body. Like hearing a thought that wasn't yours. She smiled often, but never with joy, only hunger. Madame Thorne changed as well. She no longer used singular pronouns. "We will prepare. You," she said one morning. "We will polish the key. We will rejoice in the unsealing." Her eyes remained gray, but her voice was plural. It vibrated in Elspeth's sternum. It left her fingers numb. Whatever Thorne had once been headmistress, guide, warden was long gone. She was now only the custodian, a caretaker of flesh, a gardener of sacrifice. It was in the sealed records chamber that Elspeth found the truth. The room was hidden beneath the northern wing, behind shelves of dusty hymnals and fractured candles. She entered by accident, or so she told herself. Inside, stacks of ledgers, ink faded with age. Bound in skin. Each labeled with a year. She opened one at random, 1800, then another, 1830, then 1860. Each listed student names, notes beside them, some marked resistant, others acceptable, a few simply, "Read, vessel." She flipped toward the final pages. And found a letter, yellowed, brittle, not addressed to anyone. It read, "This was once a monastery, but not for God. Beneath it lies an altar, older than faith, hungrier than sin. It opens once every 30 years. Always 30. They used to offer cattle, then children, then memory. Now they raise them, feed them prayer, ripen them with silence. On the 3rd year, they are harvested. The door must have a key. The vessel must be willing. The vessel must be hollow." At the bottom of the page, "This year is the 30th, and she is ready." Underlined, in a different hand, was a single name, Elspeth Caro. She staggered back, the room tilted. In the corner, a shadow shifted, tall, thin, wrapped in veils. Miriam. She did not speak. She only raised one hand and pointed to Elsbeth's chest. Later that night, Elspeth peeled away her gown and found a mark just below her sternum, a black sigil. Circular, pulsing slightly, a symbol she remembered from her first concordance, back when she thought it was language. Now she knew it was a lock, and she was no longer a girl, she was a door. When she returned to her dormitory, someone had left salt on her pillow, and a needle beside it. No note. No explanation, just a silent instruction, prepare. Elspeth stood in the chapel that night alone. The bells did not toll. The portraits seemed to breathe, and in the silence, she whispered, "Why me?" No answer came, only the whisper of wind through stained glass, and the echo of Madame Thorne's voice from her first day. "Do not ask about the bell tower." Now she knew why. The bell tower was not to be feared because of what it contained, but because of what it opened. The salt room was never on any seminary map. Not in the blueprints, not in the headmistress's ledgers, not in the whispered gossip passed between trembling first years after lights out. But Elspeth always knew it was real, because something in her had been preparing for it since her first breath inside these walls. They came for her just before dusk. To students' 3rd years, or what remained of them. Their faces were veiled, hands folded, no words, just a silent gesture. "Come." Elspeth followed. Barefoot, gown soaked in vinegar, sigils scrawled in red across her spine. Her heartbeat was slow now, not from fear, but anticipation, like the body knew it had one final task before it was discarded. They led her beneath the seminary, deeper than the chapel, deeper than the crypt, past rusted iron gates and locked corridors, into the place no one spoke of, the salt room. It was cavernous. Circular. The walls were raw stone, coated in centuries of salt. It clung to the air, the floor, her teeth. Her tongue cracked when she breathed. The whole room shimmered in candlelight like it had been carved from bone. At the center, the door, obsidian, towering. And breathing, not metaphorically. With each chant, it inhaled. With each silence, it exhaled. As though fed by devotion. It had no hinges. No handle. Just a surface so black it reflected not light, but memory. Round the door, students knelt in concentric circles, naked but for veils, their eyes stitched shut. They rocked slowly, mouths open in voiceless chant. The sound came from within their throats, not music, not language, but the vibration of surrender. Madame Thorne stood just before the door. She had removed her veil. Her eyes, once gray, were now gone. To empty sockets, weeping salt. Her voice shook as she spoke. "This is our hour. This is her bloom. The key awakens. The door remembers." She reached into her own skull. There was no resistance. She pulled and laid her eyes at the door's base like coins at a ferryman's feet. Miriam stepped forward next, her smile wide, joyous, cruel. She held a blade carved from polished bone. Her tongue unfurled slowly from her mouth like a final confession. She placed it on the altar and cut. No scream. Just breath. Blood dripped in steady rhythm. The students swayed faster. The door pulsed. Elspeth could no longer hear. The sound had moved inside her. Her bones thrummed. Her pulse no longer matched her heartbeat. The obsidian door reflected her image, and it was not the girl she remembered. Older, taller. Her skin pale as ash, her eyes hollow, and upon her head a crown of salt and thorns. She did not look afraid. She looked complete. The ascended, and standing behind her Annabel Wren, or her echo, or her shadow. No longer afraid, no longer human. Her hands reached forward, hovering just above Elsbeth's shoulders. As if blessing or binding, Madame Thorne spoke again, but her voice came from every mouth in the room. The vessel is ripened. Let the self fall away. Let the lock break. The door surged with heat, salt, turned to steam. Elsbeth's knees buckled. Her vision spiraled. But something inside her twisted. No, it wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. Just a resistance, a muscle tightening, a breath withheld, a memory remembered. Leona's laugh, Faye's humming, Miriam's rage, her mother's hand brushing back her hair, the diary, the fear, the staircase in her dreams, the throne, the crown, and a voice. If the vessel fights, the door remains sealed. Elspeth screamed. Not aloud. Within. The reflection in the door fractured. The crown cracked. The obsidian rippled. Madame Thorne collapsed. Miriam fell to her knees, blood still leaking from her mouth. The students froze, and the door exhaled. Once. Twice. Then stillness. Elspeth stood alone. Everyone else was on the floor, silent, waiting. The door no longer pulsed. Her reflection is gone. She turned from it. The altar did not follow. The salt room was crumbling. Not physically, not yet, but something beneath its design had fractured. The obsidian door had stopped breathing. The chants had quieted, and Elspeth remained standing. The ritual was paused, not broken, but the threads were loose now, and the silence had teeth. She felt the pull, the ancient weight behind the ceremony, the invisible hand urging her forward. But she did not move toward the door. She turned away from it, faced the room, faced them, the stitched-eyed girls, the veiled husks, the kneeling shadows that once had names. And at the center, Madame Thorne, still bleeding from her empty sockets, still murmuring prayers from tongues not her own. She whispered, "You are the gate. Speak the seal. Become the hollow." But Elspeth did not speak in tongues. She whispered only one thing, her name. Elspeth Caro, softly at first, the syllables strange in her throat like something she hadn't said aloud in years. Elspeth Caro. Again. Stronger. A defiance, a declaration, a return. Elspeth Caro. The room flinched. The others began to twitch. The kneeling girls trembled. One collapsed backward, her veil falling off, revealing hollow sockets filled with salt. Elspeth raised her voice, louder now. Not just her name, but others. Names she had read in the crypt. Names she had carried like secret prayers. Genevieve Ellsworth, Annabelle Wren, Leona Ward, Faye Holland, Miriam Vale, Elspeth Caro, Elspeth Caro, Elspeth Caro. The name echoed, folding the room in on itself. The obsidian door groaned. The salt room cracked. Madame Thorne reached toward her with bloodied hands, but something had changed. The skin on her face began to slough away, peeling like old wallpaper. Not peeling, rotting. Maggots squirmed in the hollows of her mouth. Her voice now came from her stomach. Wet and low, you cannot undo what was sealed before time. Elspeth whispered again, almost tenderly, then let time end. Miriam screamed, a high, rattling wail that burst into fractals. Her face split open down the center like clay under pressure, and from within, mouths, hundreds, stacked in layers. Beneath her skin, tiny, whispering mouths that hissed names, curses, laughter. Some wept, others bit at the air. They echoed voices of long-dead girls. They cried out for release, for return, for silence. Miriam's eyes rolled back. Her knees gave way. The veils ignited. The obsidian door shattered. Not with a bang, but with a sigh. Like glass remembering it had once been sand. It dissolved inward, peeling open like the mouth of a void. But nothing waited on the other side. No creature. No kingdom. No divine light. Only a silence so deep it folded sound. The salt room shook. The seminary groaned. Elspeth turned back once more. The room was collapsing. The walls curled inward. The portraits burned. The students, those still living, ran, stumbled, screamed. Those already emptied fell still, crumbling like dried leaves. Madame Thorne's body folded into itself. She smiled as her spine snapped. Miriam crawled toward the door on shattered knees. But the door did not take her. It refused. Elspeth stood alone, the center of the storm, and she whispered her name one final time, Elspeth Caro. Then the seminary collapsed, not like a building falls, but like a memory ends. One breath, then salt, stone, scripture, and scream folded inward. Everything vanished. The tower, the bells, the rooms, the names, even the ground. Elspeth fell, not through space, but through self, through history, through every girl who came before, through the spiral of rituals and blood and silence. She fell until there was nothing left to fall from, and then stillness, no wind, no sound, no self, and in that stillness a breath. She opened her eyes. There was light, not much, the barest silver above her, fog curling around broken trees, soil still damp with salt. She was lying in a clearing. Her gown was torn. Her hands were bruised, but she was whole, and she was alone. She stood, turned slowly. No seminary. No ruins, only silence, only memory, and even that fading. She whispered a name, Leona, and nothing answered. She whispered another, Annabelle, and a single crow took flight. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, there was no chant behind them. She walked. One step, then another. Back into the world, whatever that meant, whatever remained, and in the earth behind her, where salt still stained the soil, something deep and buried shifted. A heartbeat. Distant. Waiting. Elspeth awoke on the cliffs at the edge of Dagger's Hollow. The wind was cold, the sky the color of soot and milk. She lay on grass too green for the season, her gown torn and stiff with dried blood. Salt clung to her lashes. Her breath came slow, deliberate, like she wasn't sure it still belonged to her. She stood. Her legs trembled but obeyed. And when she turned, the seminary was gone. No tower, no chapel, no crypt, no salt room, not even rubble, just grass, soft and swaying, as though nothing had ever stood there at all, only the faintest impression in the earth, like a scar that time refused to speak of. She stumbled into town days later. Dirty, starving, wild-eyed. The townsfolk brought water, blankets, a chair in the corner of the inn. When she spoke of Everwell, their eyes darkened. Some scoffed, others grew frightened. A man at the bar whispered, "Everwell Seminary? Burned down nearly 100 years ago." A woman shook her head. It never existed. They told her no such place had stood on the cliffs, that the land had always been empty, a myth, perhaps an old folk tale. She did not argue. But that night, in the attic above the inn, Elspeth began to write. She tore blank pages from old hymnals, used ink pressed from wild berries. Her fingers trembled, but she wrote everything she could remember, each name, each scream, each sigil carved into skin. She wrote the rituals in reverse, as she'd performed them. She listed the girls who had vanished, and those who had returned with other voices. She drew the door again and again, obsidian, crowned, waiting. She knew it would not be enough, but it was something. Memory was the only rebellion left. She stayed for 1 season. Then vanished. No one saw her leave. Only the written pages remained, bound in twine and tucked beneath a pew at the edge of the churchyard. A note on the cover: "If the door opens again, you must remember who you are. Say your name. Say all of ours, EC." And then, years later, on a cold autumn morning, in a town 2 counties east, a girl named Clara Meeks returned home from school. On the table, a letter. No stamp, no postmark, just sealed in deep red wax. Inside, "We are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted to Everwell Seminary for Girls. Please arrive before the first frost. No return address. No explanation. Just one line at the bottom: obedience, silence, sacrifice." Clara turned the envelope over in her hand. A bell tolled in the distance, and though she had never heard it before, she knew exactly where it came from. Far beneath the cliffs, under stone and time, the shattered door, silent for years, began to hum. Softly. Patiently, as though remembering how to breathe.